So Nate's talk was how to generate evidence within your own program, and I'm going to be talking about sort of the other pillar of evidence-based policy making, systematic reviews, how they're used to develop evidence on which you can design your programs, justify your programs. So before I get started, how many people have read a systematic review? Raise your hand. All right. How many people aren't sure if they read a systematic review? Okay. So I'll say right off the bat, you probably read literature reviews, but you may not have read, particularly in the environment and in agriculture, read a systematic review. And I'm going to try to tell you what the difference is between those two concepts. So I'm just going to talk about what it is, why you want to commission one as an agency, what questions are they useful for, and where to go for help to get one done. All right, so like I said before, the systematic reviews are more than just literature reviews. They're a form of research that uses secondary observations, unlike the experiment, which is primary data. You're developing your own evidence. Systematic reviews are taking it from other places. It's using studies as the unit of analysis. It's following precise, transparent steps in the research process, and the aim is to minimize bias and error. Literature reviews are often just summaries of the landscape and don't have the same transparency and the same aims as a systematic review. Right? Before I tell you exactly where it is, I just want to tell you where they come from. So systematic reviews come out of the evidence-based medicine revolution that started in the 70s, 80s, and really gathered steam in the 90s, where there was this concern that a lot of treatments and drugs and practices that doctors were doing were not based on solid evidence, and doctors were unaware of what is the evidence for dealing with particular issues or underlying certain practices, treatments, drugs. And so the Cochrane collaboration was created to start to do very systematic reviews. And again, we'll talk about what we mean by that, and then get them out there to practitioners so they understood what's known and what's not known underlying their practices. So the arguments in favor of doing systematic reviews is there's a huge amount of information and research out there, and it's of highly variable quality. And one of the most important insights to recognize is just because something's peer-reviewed doesn't mean it's any good. This is a common thing where people say, oh, it's peer-reviewed research. There's a lot of junk in peer-reviewed research. Just because two people took a look at it and maybe an editor does not mean it's high quality. And so there's a real need to separate the wheat from the chaff. And this was recognized in medicine, and it's particularly true in agriculture and the environment. And so not only that, but we have this problem of publication bias, that the flashy results tend to be the ones that get put in reports and get put on websites and the media picks up, and things where the evidence was less encouraging tend to not find their way out into the public. And so being able to detect whether or not we're seeing publication bias is an important role for systematic reviews, and also helping us get past the limitation of single studies. We've often done this in our own lectures, where we point to a single study and say this shows that reducing the complexity works. These systematic reviews try to pull together all the evidence on a particular sort of intervention to give people a better sense of whether it works or not. And this is particularly important in agriculture and the environment, where we have a lot of popular conceptions about what works under what conditions that are based on limited studies or studies with very poor designs. I'm just going to give you an example. So we still haven't gotten to the elements of systematic review, and we're going to get there, but just to motivate it. So I even heard Jason Willow talk about drop nozzle, low drift irrigation technology. Right? And these have been subsidized by state and federal government throughout the United States, and one of the reasons is because of the belief that it reduces water use. Right? And where is that coming from? The studies are largely from ag experiment stations, where they've got same crops and the conditions. They randomize the new technology and the old technology, and they see that the old technology yields the same production. The new technology yields the same production, but 20% less water. Or they might look at people who have adopted it, farmers, versus farmers who have not adopted it. And there's problems with both of those sources of evidence. The ag experiment stations don't change behavior. They assume farmers adopt new technology and don't change anything about their production practices, which is implausible. And the with and without had this problem that Nate brought up, what he called selection bias, is that the reasons or the characteristics of the farmers who are adopting new technologies are often very different from the characteristics or attributes of the farmers who are not, in ways that also affect how they use inputs like irrigation or water. And recently there was a paper that tried to address both of these problems, where they said, okay, we're going to go to the overall aquifer, we've got good time series data, longitudinal data on farmer irrigation use, and we've got some farmers adopting, some not, and we're really going to work to try to control for those differences that also affect water use. So that what we're, as Nate said, in these quasi-experiments, they tried to get back to what it would look like had we actually run a randomized controlled trial where we gave some farmers the technologies and other farmers we did not. So there's one study that really tried to deal with these sources of bias, and they found not only did it not reduce by as much as the engineers, ag engineers claim, but it actually increased water use. And the great thing about this study is they also had data on area under irrigation and the crops that farmers were growing over time, and they showed that once they adopted these technologies, they expanded the area of under irrigation because it was cheaper to deliver water to those areas, and they changed the crops to more water demanding crops. And so this is one study, and it's one location. And so what systematic reviews start to do, they start to look at the evidence, what's out there, and start to evaluate it based on the quality of the design. And so what makes a systematic review systematic? So some key characteristics. The first one is defining an answerable question. It's not like what contributes to sustainability. Right? These are very narrowly focused questions like, do more efficient irrigation technology reduce water use by farmers? And it might even be more narrow, farmers in the Midwest. They're corn farmers. They make very transparent methods about how they're going about answering this question. And importantly, they publish these study protocols. So they say exactly how they're going to do it, and we'll show those kind of methods that they use. And they publish it before they even start. It allows for a peer review or a comment period where people evaluate how the folks are going to go about doing this. They do a rigorous search to identify published and unpublished sources in any language, so they don't exclude non-peer-reviewed or gray literature, because that's often where studies that didn't have the big impacts get out. They apply this particular kind of criteria we talk about is what to include and what not. Literature reviews typically include everything, right? And systematic reviews have very clear criteria for what they're going to include. And particularly number 4, they're going to praise the study quality. They're going to exclude a lot of things of low quality, and then even the things they include, they're going to upweight things that are much higher quality designs, things that are much more believable in terms of measuring causal effects of particular interventions or programs or policies. So they're going to assess how reliable the evidence is. Then they're going to extract the data and organize it. They're going to synthesize the evidence, and they're going to look at outcomes along the causal chain. They're going to interpret the results, and they're going to try to improve and update the reviews as new evidence emerges. So these are not just things that get published and that's it. They're usually live documents, and particularly with the internet, that's become a reality where these things are continually updated or revised every few years so that practitioners can see what the latest evidence suggests is out there. All right, so talk about the stages of a systematic review. So the first one is the problem formulation, clarifying your questions and writing a protocol, setting explicit inclusion-exclusion criteria. Then you go about collecting the data, doing the literature research, information gathering from different studies, and you do the data evaluation, where you establish first the criteria for excluding and including studies and assessing study quality. This is actually the biggest part of systematic reviews, is just all this, and making it very transparent and very systematic and clarifying what you're doing. And then the extra work is the data analysis and interpretation. That's actually just like a randomized controlled trial where all the work is up front in the design and making sure you've got a treatment group and a control group. And then measuring the data is just measuring the different averages and outcomes or medians or distributions. It's very straightforward. The same thing in a systematic review. The data analysis is rather straightforward, and then you've got the report preparation of showing the different results. All right, so let's talk about these different aspects. So the problem formulation. All right, so the first thing you're trying to do is combine results of studies that to some degree are often varying in their methods, treatments, samples, and outcome measures. And not just saying, like often literature review does, this study said this and this other study found that, and not really giving you a good idea of how these things may differ along a variety of dimensions. You get different things, trying to compare apples, oranges, and other fruits. And you've got some that might be down to the level of individuals, some that might be farms, some might be entire areas, and trying to be able to synthesize that takes careful consideration. And you've got to decide, given that variation, what's going to be included and how you're going to synthesize the results. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. So I didn't really cherry pick it. So I just went to the journal called Environmental Evidence. It's a new journal that publishes systematic reviews in the environmental arena, and I picked the most recent publication at the very top of the list when they're posting recent publications. It's about how effective created and restored freshwater wetlands for nitrogen and phosphorus removal, a systematic review. Right? And the first thing that they do is problem formulation. What's the objective? And putting the primary question very clearly stated. I've underlined it here. How effective are created and restored freshwater wetlands for nitrogen removal and phosphorus retention? And then clearly talking more specifically, we're talking about the relation between removal and load, and expressing effectiveness in terms of removal rates and relative removal as percent of the load. And they're talking about, we're talking reduced amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water phase, and giving a little bit more precision to exactly what we're talking about here, so people are clear what they're going to be talking about. Very specific, narrow question. There might be secondary questions, but the primary question is very specific and narrow. And that's useful for testing specific effects like we saw there. Some systematic reviews will have broader global questions like what's the role of participation in natural resource management, getting community participation in the process. Those are generally useful for generating new knowledge, identifying common elements of effective programs, building better intervention theories, which can then go be tested out in the field through randomized controlled trials. And both types, whether they're specific narrow questions or broad global questions, help identify gaps in the evidence base. And a lot of fields, when they first start doing these systematic reviews, so medicine 20 years ago, education about 10 years ago, and international development, what they found is that a lot of these systematic reviews are mostly about the gaps, and pointing out that despite the fact that we might have hundreds of articles on particular topics, very few of them are credible, and there's huge gaps in understanding of what's effective and what's not. So systematic reviews, we're focusing here about evidence on programs, right? And so we're talking about effects of different interventions, but you'll also see others that are just about trends. What do we know about pollution trends? What do we know about trends in wildlife or changes in farming practices? They might be diagnostic or prognostic tests. That's often in medicine, but other cases people might have it as well. How good of a predictor are particular types of technologies that we might be promoting? And a common misperception is that they're only limited to quantitative data from randomized controlled trials. That tended to be the case in medicine because they have a lot of randomized controlled trials, but even there things have changed where people realize you can get useful information from qualitative studies or well-designed quasi-experiments where people try to carefully control for the differences between those exposed to an intervention and those not exposed to an intervention. But it takes more work. It takes expertise to do that, but people are doing lots of mixed method systematic reviews. All right, so the ones that we tend to be focused on agri-environmental programs is what works for different kinds of interventions. What are the effects of intervention X, like drop nozzle irrigation technology adoption, on outcomes Y, water use, and it might be for population Z, corn farmers or crop farmers in general in the United States. And then people might do variations on this theme, the difference in effects from different kinds of interventions, certain kinds of drop nozzle technology, A versus B. Those might be also the way the things are framed. All right, so the first thing after the problem is formulated, people outline the search strategy. So I'm not doing the whole article, I'm just giving you bits of the pieces, but this is actually a long section which tells exactly how I'm going to search. One of the hard things about literature reviews is you're not sure how did those articles get in there and what might be missing, because you don't know exactly how the author sought those articles. In systematic reviews, it's very transparent, it's replicable. You can actually replicate that review by following exactly what the authors did. And then they spend time talking about what they're going to include, right, in this. They're going to talk about specific things. They're going to be here talking the type of water entering the wetlands. Untreated wastewater was not considered since it's not permissible to discharge such water into the environment in most European countries where this systematic review was focused. And then they've got a whole bunch of exclusion criteria that they'll be talking about. And generally people follow what's called, you can't really see that, it's called the PICOS framework, P-I-C-O framework, COS framework. The P's for population, you define exactly the population of participants that you're going to be focused on. You define exactly the interventions that are relevant, if that's what you're focused on, interventions rather than trends. You focus exactly on what's allowable as a comparison group, right? Is it what's going to be the counterfactual? Is it no program at all? Right? Is it going to be a different kind of program, a different kind of intervention? You outline exactly what outcomes you're going to be looking at, whether and which ones are primary or secondary, and you're going to outline what study designs are includable. Right? So in medicine, they often only include randomized controlled trials. But in the ag and environment and other fields where they're not as common, they'll allow for other study designs. And then some frameworks might say we're going to narrow it to specific geographic areas, specific time periods, language, or other criteria, but it's all very transparent, so people can understand what they're getting from it. So here's an example from that article where it's talking about the specific subject: secondary, tertiary treated domestic wastewater, urban stormwater, stream river water, freshwater aquaculture effluents, and runoff from agricultural fields. The type of interventions that they're going to look at, the type of comparator. In this case, it's no intervention, right? It's restored wetlands versus nothing was done to the wetlands. Type of outcomes that they're looking at, and the types of studies that they're going to consider as part of that systematic review. And these eligibility criteria tend to focus on inclusion criteria with a few exclusion criteria. And importantly, people don't focus on just on the large sample sizes where they get the small p-values. They include everything. And also, like I mentioned before, regardless of publication status, it could be in the top journal or it could be in a government report or an NGO report. The key features are those inclusion criteria, not where it actually got published or what it found. All right, and so which studies should be included? This is a really important part of systematic reviews, is a focus on the quality of the studies and not treating them all equally and excluding designs that have poor scientific quality for inferring causal effect or intervention effects. All right, so the general idea is garbage in, garbage out. If you're putting in lots of studies that are garbage, that's what you're going to get out of it. Right, so that you want to focus on what you consider credible evidence, and that may differ depending on the authors, but they have to state exactly what they mean by credible evidence. What's going to be included, what kinds of designs, and setting clear standards, typically based on the principles of causal inference, what allows for us to say this is truly an impact from this intervention, rather than some spurious result that we're getting because we didn't control for other rival explanations. And the designs have to be relevant for the topic and context. For example, in medicine, they can depend more exclusively on randomized controlled trials. In ag and the environment, we might not be able to because simply there are just not that many out there. So here's an example of a study quality assessment from that particular systematic review. And you can see where they are focused on specific criteria, risk of bias, the sampling frequency, control, the quantification, the removal processes, the effect modifiers, and whether it had been replicated or not. So again, they're trying to be very transparent on how they assess quality of design. And then they're going to try to assign different studies into categories. This one has 3 categories, where category 1 is high risk of bias, meaning that it's harder to believe the results of this study. You're not sure what you can take away from it. And then they've got category 2, which is moderate risk of bias, and category 3 has the moderate risk of bias plus some of those other characteristics from that previous table, might have been replicated. They might have quantified particular removal processes, like the mechanisms. And this study decided that Category 1 is not going to be allowed. Right? Category 2 they will allow, Category 3, but they will upweight Category 3, which is the more credible studies. Again, it's very different from how systematic reviews, which all the peer literature gets put in there, and it's sort of like a count process. 10 articles said yes, 8 articles said no. So this is very typical of systematic reviews, where you go from a vast library of studies that once you start applying these criteria, it dramatically gets lower. 93 is actually quite high for environmental systematic reviews, and it's because it's particularly focused on science-based, these restored wetlands, rather than a practice-based study or a program-based study. But they went from 935 to 93, of which only 39 articles were in that Category 3 of high credibility or high quality. Now let's give you another example of another systematic review was done recently of decentralized forest management and the impacts of basically giving local people more control over forest management in low and middle income countries and the effects on deforestation and poverty. They started with 1,272 articles on decentralized forest management. It's a cottage industry in the social sciences. After screening, using basically similar screens, they were left with 12 studies, and of them, there were 8 different programs that they were looking at. Right? And one of the most important things about this particular systematic study, systematic review, is it told the donors that no, there isn't a good evidence base on which all this funding is being allocated to these programs. Just because there are 12, there's study after study every year talking about this, when you actually look at the quality of the studies, it's very difficult to infer anything about the actual impacts of these programs. And this has generated, in some areas, some donors like World Bank, more of an effort to start generating evidence from the programs rather than relying on other studies to tell them about the impacts. All right, so we talked about before, you have a detailed protocol that gets published online so people can comment on. This increases the transparency and limits ad hoc decisions. And importantly, so now you have this protocol, so this is what I'm going to do, and then you publish your review after, and people recognize that things change. Once you start doing the review, you realize things you may not have realized before, but you have to address that in the review. We changed our protocol for these reasons. Not because ad hoc, because we didn't like the answer we were getting, and we wanted to change the criteria to bring in more positive studies or bring in more negative studies. So it's, again, increasing the transparency. And then you can start on the analysis. And the first thing that studies do that have enough studies to look at, systematic reviews do that have enough studies to look at, is they look for publication bias. All right, so the first thing they want to look at is, are we getting certain kinds of studies? Because there's lots of evidence from other fields that suggest that what gets published are the big hits, the small p-value, big impact stuff. And there could be tens of studies showing no impact, but they don't get published or they get to see the light of day. So what they're doing here is just roughly, what they're looking for is 95% of the studies, if there's no publication bias, should be in this triangle. There's standard error, measure of variance here, and measure of impact here, negative meaning reduce and positive meaning increase the load. And when you look at these particular studies, most of them are in this triangle. You see sort of an absence of these positive impacts, meaning that these restored wetlands increase the amount of environmental effluents and things going out. You don't see many of those, but in general, when you look at this, you don't see much publication bias. But in other studies, what you often see is a high amount in the upper left-hand corner. What's that? That's sort of these big dramatic reductions in environmental damage that are estimated really precisely. I mean, the p-value is really small. And when you see a large concentration of that, it's hard to believe that, because the scientific process should generate something where there's lots of dots falling around inside of that triangle. Then people typically start with a narrative synthesis. This is what you might see in a literature review, where people try to summarize what are we seeing, are there any patterns we're seeing from these results. And then if there's enough studies, people will do meta-analysis, a more formal quantitative analysis, generally doing one or two or both of these things. The first one are these forest plots, or blobograms or blobographs, as people call them. They give people in a pictorial form a sense of where the treatment effects seem to lie. Right here they seem to be negative, meaning that these wetlands are reducing these pollution indicators. And then they have these confidence intervals saying that a lot of them cover zero, but there tends to be a general movement to the left, meaning that there's pretty good evidence suggesting these things actually do remove pollutants in a desirable way. You can break it up by different kinds of conditions one might want to look at. Here they're looking at different kinds of ecosystems up at the top, or environments. They're looking at different natures of the flow, and here we're looking at the kinds of runoff that you're getting, agricultural versus others, to get a sense of the heterogeneity of the impact effects that might be relevant for policy and practice. And then they might throw it into regression analysis, where there's a whole field that's been going on since at least the 70s, where how do you do regression analysis on studies, where the studies are the observations, and they have different sample sizes, different methods, different quality. And so there's different ways to do this, but the punchline here in this case is that that first one is all wetlands, so this has a negative effect, and they give you the standard errors on it, that there's a median removal of 37% of the load, the pollution load, and then they try to get at some of that heterogeneity again. Right, so the regression gives you the opportunity to control for some other factors and increase the precision of your estimates and give you some specific numbers that you can put into analyses or into final reports if you're trying to measure the aggregate impacts of your portfolio. All right, so that's how you do it. Roughly, we're just trying to cover the basics of this and know this. What's required? You need a team. No individual tends to do these by themselves because you need multiple perspectives when you're going through the search and assessing quality. Typically, you have two eyes on every study, so to make sure that you're making consistent decisions. So you need a team with topic expertise, methodological expertise for systematic review, statistical expertise if they're going to go do some of these meta-analyses, and expertise on information retrieval. And you need time and money. They tend to be labor intensive. They cost generally $50,000 to $150,000 depending on the scope, complexity, and number of studies. And like I said, the Cochrane Collaboration is an organization that does these systematic reviews. They're commissioned by NIH, they might be commissioned by hospitals, by Wellcome Trust, or other sorts of institutions that want to know about the evidence of particular treatments or interventions. They have a library that disseminates these systematic reviews and has clear templates, so this is how they should be presented. Like Jason talked about, we need very clear communication, so they all have a lay summary that's not technical for more general audiences. Later to the game, we have these other things that are closer to ag and the environment. We have the Campbell Collaboration, which is promoting systematic reviews in social welfare and education and criminal justice. We've got the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, which among other things is promoting systematic reviews in international development. And in the environment, it's even more recent, less well developed. We've got Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, which is promoting systematic reviews that get published in one of two places, the Journal Environmental Evidence or the websites and open access Journal Conservation Evidence. Very little on agriculture so far in those outlets. And importantly, there's other agencies, groups that are commissioning systematic reviews. So this is different in the UK, focuses on international development, but their counterpart in agriculture in the UK, whose acronym I've now forgotten, is also doing this where they're opening up RFPs. Here are specific questions that we are interested in. And they're getting people apply, just like they apply for a grant to do a systematic review. They commission these systematic reviews and then they publish them online and disseminate them to their staff and their stakeholders to help improve the evidence base for what they're working on. And when they notice there are important gaps, they tend to fund, if they can, randomized controlled trials or careful evaluations of existing or new programs to try to build up that evidence base. USDA actually has an initiative for systematic reviews. I'm not sure how many people were familiar with this before I put it up. This is on the nutrition side. So on the nutrition side, they've got the Nutrition Evidence Library that specializes in conducting systematic reviews to inform federal nutrition policies and programs. combining staff with helping define what the questions are and collaborators, scientists to actually do the systematic reviews, and then getting them online in a repository, a library, and according to the website, disseminating them to important stakeholders so people are more aware of what the evidence is for a variety of different nutrition policies and programs. EPA is starting to put its toe in the water in systematic reviews, but it's largely on the pure science side. Like, what do we know about toxicity of this particular chemical? And as far as I can tell, there's nothing on the program side. What do we know about programs to reduce toxic pollutant production or storage on site, or how people handle it? But making some inroads in there. So, assistance with systematic reviews. CBEAR is something we have not had anybody interested in them yet, but that is part of our proposal and part of our staffing in terms of being able to deliver on these. And so, you can do those. ERS probably has the ability as well to do those. The social and behavioral science team is not exactly what they do. They're more focused on the randomized controlled trials. But this is a way, if you don't see ability to do a randomized controlled trial, but you want to have a better sense of the evidence underlying the program theory that you're using to justify and motivate a program or program change, CBEAR can help with that. And with that, I'll open up. We've got about 5 minutes or so for questions or concerns of systematic reviews. Yeah, Dan and Marka.
So what's your sense on the 90% of studies that were rejected? Is there really no value in that? In your particular example, that may not be unusual.
So there's differing opinions. My opinion, and I would say and it's shared by probably a majority, is that those studies are great for hypothesis generation. That those studies give intriguing results that may reflect a reality, a causal effect, but they're not. Wouldn't draw inferences. And what people are arguing is that these systematic reviews are forcing a change in the way science gets practiced, particularly on the policy and social science side. In that, on the ag situation, if you had a new technology or new crop, experimentation would be really strict on how people test it. They wouldn't think of promoting unless it had been tested on some ag stations. But then when it comes out to getting farmers to use it and what the impact's going to be, let's get farmer-to-farmer workshops. Let's get incentive payments to get some of the key farmer leaders to try it out, and then that will spill over to others. And we don't have very good studies or evidence to underlie those sorts of policies and programs. When in education, when they created a repository called the What Works Clearinghouse, people were calling it a What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse because there was very little on it, and the few studies that were on there showed no impacts from very popular programs. But what it did is it spurred people to start developing better evidence. And now the site is populated with lots of successful programs as well as unsuccessful ones, but a lot more credible evidence. But by saying we're not going to accept the way most of this stuff is done because you can't draw credible inferences or conclusions from it, spur people to do a better job. So less quantity, more quality in terms of the research evaluations.
So this is a related question, but you made the case that only the really strong results will get published. What about...
For publication bias, yeah.
Yeah, the publication bias. Isn't there also a bias towards any study that has a similar result, no matter how strong it is?
Right, so that's another problem, is that you can get replications and you can't find a place for that. So I found the same effect and people say, so what? I mean, we already solved that effect.
Actually, kind of the way around. If you're too weird, people won't believe you.
And it goes both ways. Generally, the evidence suggests that when you find no effect, those are hard to get published, both because often those studies might be underpowered. Right? So to actually do a proper replication, you need to have higher power than the original study. And then the other one is because there might be already an established wisdom now from the first study that went to the top journal, big effect, got lots of media and scientific attention. Now you come along with your study and say, I didn't find that. That's just part of a one-off. But you're right. For all those reasons, you have this problem that certain studies become very influential, But that's part of the systematic review to say, hey, I mean, this is what they've done in social psychology, where they had this, what they call the replication crisis, that when people started looking at some of these signature studies that were, the big studies that everybody knew about, they found dozens of studies that had tried to replicate it and couldn't, but they were not in good journals or any journals at all. And then once people sort of systematically collected that data and presented it, people said, oh my God, that first study that we thought was the established wisdom may not be at all. That it seems like the bulk of the evidence is the opposite, that there's nothing there. But yeah, I think more likely the idea is that editors of scientific journals, program managers, they like to see the big results in desired or anticipated direction, and that's what gets popularized and disseminated. Yeah.
There's two steps to this, because one is bad data and one is bad modeling. So, for example, quality assurance, quality control is a standard practice. I assume every agency has it, Forest Service has theirs, everybody else does. And that's designed to make sure your data is statistically correct. You're not creating things out of it that you shouldn't be creating out of it. It always follows the rules, and you can rely on the data. So, really, you're talking about two separate problems, right? You're talking about whether the study is a valid study or not.
So part of the